Welcome, everybody. Today is episode 3 in our digital ethics series. Our focus today will be on data governance in the digital era, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Reed Blackman and Dr. Jane Thomason, who are our guests today. Leadership in the digital era has come up a lot lately, right? So because I think there are two sides of the coin. On the one hand, like we said before a few minutes ago, people say, yes, it's the algorithm and you need to design the processes the way we discussed. But if you don't have strong leadership and strong governance and a person that will define the expectations, then it's going to still turn out bad. So maybe we can also touch a little bit on how do we define what skills in this era are necessary. Maybe we weren't planning on that, but I think it's relevant as it came up. So Reed, do you have thoughts? How would you define ethical leadership in the digital era? Is there any difference compared to leadership in any other era or not?
One thing it's going to require is an actual understanding of ethics. I think a lot of people are generally thrown off by the concept of ethics. I think that most institutions, at least corporations, financial institutions, they struggle to find ways of not saying the word ethics. That's why everyone talks about sustainability, because it's a way of saying ethics without saying the word ethics. Or you talk about ESG criteria, because it's a way of saying ethics without actually saying ethics. So if you're going to actually have ethical leadership, you better have someone who's comfortable saying the word ethics and says it in a way that doesn't just conflate it with compliance. The kinds of issues that we're talking about when we talk about things like proper data governance or data stewardship and say AI or ML ethics, machine learning ethics, why does explainability matter? Is it because it's a tool for us to ferret out biased algorithms? Is it intrinsically important that our outputs be explainable? If so, why? Is it always the case? And so on and so forth. Privacy issues. Privacy is not simple. As you know, Ingrid, being an executive in healthcare, there's privacy issues that pop up in all sorts of ways. And if you have no idea how to think about privacy, you're not, say, familiar with the relevant literature, with the relevant concepts, or with the case studies, you're just going to be at sea. And so one thing that is absolutely necessary if you're going to have ethical leadership in the digital era is you need to have not only an understanding of how the technology works, at least at the conceptual level, if not the technical and quantitative level. But you also have to have a deep familiarity with the kinds of ethical case studies and concepts that we're talking about here.
And if I could add to that too, and I think a lot of CEOs, not of the platform companies, but CEOs generally, don't necessarily have the background and education to be able to do that without additional help and education. Yeah. I think what's really important is that it is the CEO, not just abrogating anything to do with technology to the CTO and the board, who are the ones that are actually having the education and then having the debate. Because the point about ethics that's so complicated is that it's never a right or a wrong question. It's usually a question where you're debating, right against right, and you're weighing up different options and then again trying to consider how that affects trust and public welfare. So I think, first of all, there's a real need for education for boards and CEOs about both ethics and technology, and how you ensure that ethical considerations are going to be taken into the light of the work that you're doing. I expect over time, and what we're seeing now is, as we've talked about, the severe distrust of the platform companies, is that companies that are able to ensure that ethical considerations are built into what they're doing and that are able to kind of create trust and ensure the welfare of their customers are the ones in the long run who are going to succeed, because people are far more conscious of these things now. But it has to come from the top. There has to be education of leadership, in as much as there has to be public education, because we've discussed this before. People are extraordinarily ignorant about where their data is, what happens to it, what rights they have in regard to their data, and how they can have their data removed from or not on-sold or shared. So I think that there's a huge public education effort needed as well.
I'm sort of two minds about this. On the one hand, I think that it's absolutely, it would do a lot of good if the general public were familiar with what we might call broadly data ethics or data governance. It would do a lot of good, and it might go a long way in solving the problem. It wouldn't be sufficient, of course, because you also have to have the companies to do the right thing. And then there's a question about whether it's necessary. And I really hope it's not necessary, because it's a massive lift to educate a general public about such an abstract topic. So for that reason, there's an extent to which, and I could be pushed off this position. This is not, I'm not going to, die on this hill, but I'm inclined to think that there's a way in which this is not wildly dissimilar from cybersecurity. The average person doesn't know anything about cybersecurity. They know something like safe versus unsafe. They know when their stuff has been hacked. They get an email that says, your information's been compromised. But the onus is on the corporations and the businesses, the government, whomever, to make sure that they have the proper processes in place, so that they have to report, when they've really messed up, when there's been a breach of some kind. But the onus is first and foremost on the organization to take it seriously, not on the average citizen to understand something as abstract as cybersecurity.
So let me ask you then, can you have, because many times people confuse data governance with governance of a company that has a lot of technology. So can you have appropriate data governance if you don't have someone that's specialized, such as a council or a committee or an ethics consultant? I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit, but I think there are several opinions that we see. Some companies say, you know what, we can never know all the intricacies and nuances, and we need a specialized team that will handle this. Or others say, no, please teach us, we can handle it by ourselves, and then we can just sustain. So can I hear your thoughts on that?
So I'm not sure, is the contrast between having a sort of specialized team?
Correct. Like, do you need an ethics counselor or an ethics committee or an ethics council in companies that have a lot of data that they share or use, and are at risk, right? So let's say we do a risk analysis in a company, and we identify that they are at high risk. They agree they're at high risk, and they want to do good. We assume they want to do good.
Yeah.
Should they have someone specialized, or can they really do something on their own?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that they need some sort of a specialist in the area. As I said earlier, if you want ethical leadership, then you need to have someone who's deeply familiar with the relevant concepts, the literature, the case studies, et cetera. Otherwise, you're going to try to reinvent the wheel, and you're not going to do a very good job, right? So I do think that you need specialists at play. I do think something like an ethics committee is very important. It need not be a self-standing ethics committee. It could be a committee that is already existing that deals with certain kinds of, say, corporate risks, and it takes on the additional responsibility of dealing with certain kinds of ethical risks. And then, of course, there's a big question about where does the committee sit within the organization?
Exactly. How can they be how can they avoid bias, right? Because if they're part of the organization, they can be highly trained, but they'll be embedded in the ROI processes and the pressures of engaging with stakeholders, and then it can get blurry, right? So
yeah. I mean, that's why it's highly recommended that you have external ethics advisors who know the field and who are impartial and who aren't trying to get raises and promotions. I think aligning financial incentives is really important. Just the very last thing is, you want to think also about the jurisdiction of that committee. What are the kinds of things that they're going to consider? What are the processes by which other people within the organization raise issues to those committees? And then the big thing is, what are the powers of the committees, right? Is it just an advisory role to, say, a CIO or a chief analytics officer? Or to the CEO? Do they have the power to stop projects in their tracks? Do they have the power to tell product developers that, you need to change X, Y, and Z, or we're not going to greenlight this project and it has to stop there? If you don't get clear on what the powers are, then an ethics committee is not going to actually do anything. It has to have some kind of teeth.
Yeah, I did, but I'll just, I'm a bit like a cracked record. That's why I think the board and the CEO need to lead this, and the committee can feed information to the board and the CEO, but they need to make those decisions. I wanted also just to quickly come back, and I understand fully why you're saying you hope it's not necessary for this mass education of the population about their data and so forth. The one thing I do think, though, that people would like to know and would need to know is if they want to stop the continued use and sale of their personal data, how they do it.
Yeah.
And then the final point that I wanted to make, which we haven't really talked about yet, to your point, Reid, if we say, okay, it's up to the corporations, do we trust in the benevolent tendencies of the organisations that they will do that? Or is this somewhere where we really need to think some more about regulation? And then what would that regulation look like, and how would the regulators work on issues like that?
Exactly. So that brings us back to the regulatory frameworks and the public policies. So should we have a little bit more strict guidance on this? Reid, what's
Well, I
your
was reading recently, and this is just an initiative with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, who were looking around ethics and fintech and the financial system. And they've launched something called Fairness, Ethics, Accountability and Transparency Principles for the use of AI and data analytics in decision making. And they're essentially doing this as a high-level principle-based approach in collaboration with the big banks and the fintechs and the tech giants and the regulator to really try and work through some of this. So I just thought that that was an interesting approach that's been taken in Singapore that might be a basis for some further conversation about how you regulate, because, you know, I think right across a lot of digital data, fintech, blockchain, the regulators are really struggling to know what to do and how to address it. And some kind of collaborative government industry approach with some principles is one way of putting it on the table.
Mm-hmm. Reid, any thoughts? We're all three involved in a lot of frameworks and guidelines, so we can comment on all the good things that can go in it, and then I'll bring up some of the problems we have. So Reid, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so let's see, lots to say. So look, yeah, some kind of framework is a good starting point. Okay, so I should say earlier, what you said about earlier, Jane, no, we should not rely on the benevolence of corporations. I think right now there's an extent to which they are active, and that's not driven by benevolence, but by self-interest, reasonable, justified self-interest, which is to say, we don't want the reputational harms to our brand when we are in the news or go viral for all the wrong reasons, being investigated by regulators and so on. There's loads of cases of companies being sued, investigated by regulators, and suffering reputational harms from the improper stewardship of data or the creation of privacy violating, biased, unexplainable machine learning algorithms. So that's what the primary motivation is now. I don't think it's sufficient to get us to where we need to be, or at least not fast enough. So yeah, I do think that we need some kind of regulation. I'm not convinced that very high level ethical principles are the way to go. And the reason for that is the way that you get agreement on widespread principles is by watering them down so much that they don't actually point in any particular direction. So for instance, when you talk about AI ethics, people like to talk about fairness and then proudly proclaim that they're for fairness. But that is so watered down that it's something that the KKK could get behind. The KKK could say, we're for fairness. Now, they have a very different conception, not to mention a misguided one about what that actually looks like, how, what direction that points us in, as it were. But nonetheless, they could still, in principle, in the abstract, affirm the principle of fairness. So, the principles don't mean anything unless they're connected in they have to rule certain things out substantively. And if they don't do that, then they're just useless. And all they do is create a thin veneer of agreement or the appearance of agreement, when in fact there's a ton of disagreement underneath that garb.
I would push it even further. I wanted to mention, when you both brought up the issue of compliance, to not confuse ethics with compliance. And I think, yes, unfortunately, a lot of the frameworks are great to just highlight what you shouldn't do, which is sometimes fairly obvious already to organizations that intend to do well. But then they don't tell you what to do. They all say, okay, this sounds beautiful. I love that 87 or 130 page report, but what do I do tomorrow morning at 7 if I want to do something better in my organization? So maybe we can spend a few minutes also on, if I'm the CEO of a company and I'm only well-intended and I know a little bit about ethics and I will fully support you and I will make my team available. Reid, maybe you can break it down for us. And I know you recently wrote an article about how can we actually build a proactive ethics program that will be meaningful and implementable, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that there's an extent to which obviously you need that sort of senior leadership. You need some kind of board, like an ethics committee to which issues go, but it's extremely important to sort of get into the details a bit. What are the role specific responsibilities that are necessary? So, when we're talking about, say, product development and deployment, we're talking about data collectors, product developers, product managers, product owners. They all have different, obviously, roles to play within the life cycle of product development. And they need to have certain kinds of conversations with each other, and they each need to have certain kinds of or sets of responsibilities in order for the ultimate values of the organization to be lived up to. So what a CEO needs to do is make sure that there's that level of detail to the ethics program. If it's just, as you said, 145-page document, or it's just buried in some policy books, it's not going to mean anything. It has to be, what are the role-specific responsibilities various people have? And as I said before, how do our financial incentives line up with what we expect of them? Are we incentivizing them to do these things? At the very least, are we removing any disincentives from doing those things? Because my sense is that a lot of engineers, especially, they want to take this stuff really seriously, but if they don't have the organizational support to do it, which includes doing it is taken into account when it comes to time for promotion, bonuses, et cetera, then they're not going to sacrifice their careers for it, reasonably enough.
I'd like to add just another, practical example from my experience. Some time ago, when I was the CEO of a company, we were very clear on what our ethics were as a company, and we ran an ethics in action series, if you like. And this is engaging different groups in the organization and really sitting down together and talking about each ethical principle. Let's say it's like fairness. And then you say, what does fairness mean? And get some kind of shared understanding about that. And then what does it mean that you do in the workplace or in your work? And what do you not do? So really broke it down to that level where people started to be able to, give it the granularity read that you were talking about. And in my experience, it was that discussion and debate. And this was a public health company, and this was at the time of the HIV epidemic, and talking about some of those really ethical laden, value laden decisions that you might make about privacy with HIV patients. And it was only through having those kinds of debates and really exploring with the teams, what you might and might not do and where those kind of value judgments came, that we were able to kind of imbue that kind of ethical thinking throughout the organization. So it's not just create the rules, it's also about engage people in the discussion.
Exactly. So what you're describing is the culture of ethics that we always talk about. Right? I like to say it's so hard to build that culture of ethics, right? And it has to have everybody participate and engage, otherwise you can't sustain it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're 100% right. As I conceive of the role of various role responsibilities, I take among the set of those responsibilities is to have those kinds of conversations. So if you're, say, building machine learning model and you're worried about bias, you might think about, okay, if we're worried about bias in this way and that way, what would a potentially problematic data set look like? Let's talk about that with the data collectors and to have a conversation with them about what we need our data sets to look like if we're going to have all else equal unbiased outputs, right? And that's a qualitative conversation. Contrary to what's going on in some of the computer science literature on this, there's not just some, simple mathematical definition of fairness that you can slap on and solve the problem. So these kinds of conversations, you're right, are absolutely essential.
So what are some kind of questions that organizations can use to prompt and engage their employees to do kind of an ongoing risk assessment and ongoing understanding of where the culture of ethics barometer is, so to speak, in the organization? Can you both comment? Maybe Reed first and then Jane. What are some helpful talks or conversations they can have to make sure they keep a pulse on what's going on? Because many times, as we know, the way I've seen organizations, they schedule a quarterly review or an annual review, and that doesn't work for ethics, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, first of all, to do is figure out what's your, what are the goals that you're trying to achieve, or at least what are the nightmares you're trying to avoid. because what you're at, what you're at risk for is going to be relative to what you really want to avoid, right? So if you're really scared about, say, creating an AI that discriminates against Black people when it determines who's worthy of a loan, then you're going to ask questions about bias mitigation. So you might go to your product owners and say, hey, what processes do we have in place to systematically and exhaustively vet for biased algorithms? And if the answer is, well, we don't really have any, then that's a red flag, right? If you say, hey, listen, are any of our, if explainability is really important, either for regulatory reasons or ethical reasons or both, you might say, what kinds of processes do we have or for determining when an algorithm needs to be explainable versus when it doesn't have to be? So for instance, because one issue was that sometimes you trade off explainability for accuracy. And so engineers are much more inclined to go for accuracy than they are explainability. But there are some cases where explainability is really important. What are we doing to determine in the life cycle of a product, whether or to what extent explainability is important? And again, if the answer is we don't really talk about that much, another red flag.
And you're illustrating one of the points I wanted us to make to our audience, that ethics is not going to be exactly specific. You have to do this or this or this from all those right against right things. Yes, you know what's wrong, and that's pretty easy to clarify. But then most people expect very clear guidance on step 1, step 2, step 3, and it's very difficult in ethics to give them a recipe that holds true for anything they'll do. So when we just guide them, usually that these are some helpful questions and mental processes that you need to kind of go through for any topic that might come. That's the only way to build an ongoing culture of ethics that will be dynamic and that can accommodate to whatever new things you want to do, because otherwise you'll always just be prepared for whatever you had going on at a certain time, but you might want to deploy a new technology in a month or in a year, or have a new product that you never thought about from an ethics perspective, how it would be perceived, right?
So I'll just say one thing, which is that, we want to distinguish between, there's no step-by-step instructions for what ethical deliberation looks like versus step-by-step instructions for when certain kinds of conversations are required in the development and deployment process. Right. We certainly can't do that first thing. Any decent, honest, sincerely carried out ethical deliberation isn't programmatic. On the other hand, you can get fairly programmatic about, okay, this is the point in time of our thinking about the product that we're about to build when we talk about where we might mess up, right, ethically speaking. You can program those. Now, those shouldn't be the only places where those conversations come up, but there is an extent to which you can program those conversations into, say, product development and deployment.
So that's ethics by design that we've heard mentioned, right? To embed ethics into every fabric of your processes. Now, in certain industries, it's easier than others. So you mentioned healthcare before, so I can tell you in healthcare, yes, we can have certain processes, but it's difficult to embed it in every single element. So that's why we usually have an independent body that's acting as the ethics council, because it's very difficult for people that are engaged every single day in the process to keep a neutral mind and to constantly reflect and do that introspection.
Absolutely.
Jane, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, just a couple. I mean, one was just going back to the issue about the questions. I think whether it's your ethics council or whether it's a consultant or whether it's your CEO and board, I think it's incumbent on someone in an organization to do some thinking about, based on what you're doing in the organization, where there might be ethical challenges coming up that need to have conversations or need to be considered in the design of the technology. So I think there's that about framing the questions, because, the engineers aren't necessarily even going to think of the questions, let alone think about how to answer them. So I think that's one point. The other point that I was being thoughtful about while you were talking is, again, we're talking around data governance in the context of relatively, developed Western countries with good standards of education. And Ingrid, my mind went back to that issue of valid consent. And Reid, I was thinking about what you were saying about whether we did or didn't need to educate the population. But, if you think about Africa, India, emerging markets and so forth, companies are gathering and using data from people who possibly have no understanding of what it is that they've consented to. So I think there's a kind of data governance issue, which is about looking after, thinking for the welfare of the consumers who use your product in a proactive and humanistic way.
Mhm.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that brings us to the next topic I wanted us to address. I think let's pretend that the organization had good intentions. They hired the most amazing team, then they are able to sustain their processes. But how can they expand what they learned and are doing in the organization to their partners? I think that's one challenge that I've seen organizations have. Even if they do the right thing, how can you make sure that this type of ethical behavior and ethical mindset expands to all your business partners? And how should you handle it if you see that one of your business partners is maybe not engaging or endorsing that kind of ethics mindset? I think that has caused a lot of problems, right, to organizations, because then they don't know how to handle it. Should they stop ties with that organization, right? So let's pretend, let's take one that recently was in the media, right? Let's pretend I have a very nice contract with Facebook, and then Facebook is having all these fines, right, for violating data governance rules or ethics. So what should a responsible organization and purposeful organization do?
Well, I can only, again, reflect back to experiences that I had when I was the CEO of this company, because we were required, if we undertook a contract, and most of our contracting was with the government, to ensure that all of our subcontractors and anyone who received grants or services or anything from us actually upheld a series of principles, whether they were around child protection or, fair use of data and all sorts of things like that. We simply had to do that. And we did that both through due diligence and subcontracting, which seems really clumsy in this automated, data-driven world that we live in. But that was the only thing that I could think about, because if you're really serious about ensuring that ethics pervades all of your partners, then you simply have to do due diligence on them and understand when, if, and how they are applying these principles. And if they're not, I don't think you can continue to do business with them.
Exactly. But in this kind of dynamic environment where it's so hard to even figure out where all the data flows and where it's coming from, I've seen a lot of organizations that they say, well, I was given this data set. I don't know where it originated or how they got consent. All I know is what I do with it. Well, the problem started long time down the stream, right? Or after it leaves you, what do other people do with it that you share it with? Reed, any thoughts on it? How we can mitigate some of it?
Yeah, there's a couple things to say. So one is that, we talked earlier, and Jane brought this up earlier, about having some, high level principles, and when you start off, when you're defining your framework. And part of the framework has to be, what are the kinds of things that we find unacceptable in partners, right? That's got to be sort of spelled out, at least in general, but not unoperationalizable terms, right? So here's who we won't work with, or here are the conditions under which we won't work with such and such kinds of entities, and here's the rationale for it. Here are the reasons why we won't work with those kinds of companies. When you get a sort of general understanding like that, then when you come to particular cases, which are often a lot more complicated than your abstract framework can capture, you at least understand the kinds of reasons that would forbid you from working with some kinds of clients by your own lights, by your own lights. And look, there's going to be, let's be honest, sometimes there's going to be a business necessity.
Yeah.
We partner with them or we go out of business. And arguably, in some cases, a company will be required, ethically speaking, to fall on its sword, but there are other cases where it won't be ethically required to fall on its own sword, right? So it'll be cases in which we're going to have to make a kind of ethical compromise here. How can we mitigate?
Now you see, that's a word I have a problem with.
Compromise?
Yeah, no, ethical compromise.
Oh,
So
I mean, well, look, there's so first of all, there's ethical perfection, right? Which is not really attainable.
Yeah, the problem is that where people feel comfortable having that ethical compromise can move a lot. There's that gray zone, right? And I've had a lot of conversations, particularly in healthcare, right? Let's take neonatal ICU, just to give an example, where 8 years I had to deal with this. Well, where do you draw that line? It's not so clear. Yeah.
No, and so that's which is why you need the right kind of infrastructure where there can be decisions or discussions about these kinds of things that are informed by your first general understanding. But yeah, it's going to take, in most cases, it's going to take pretty close qualitative assessments or ethical analyses of the situations. Reasoning by analogy, well, this case is different from that other one because blah, blah, blah. Oh, no, it's not because yada, yada, yada. So you just have to do the work, right? You have to do the ethical work to figure out whether this really is a bridge too far.
Jane, you wanted to say something?
I agree with that. I was just, I was thinking about that example that Reid spoke about, and you started the debate about compromising ethics is, there's always the principle about how can you explain it to your mother, and how you balance those trade-offs between, if we don't do this, the company's going to go out of business. And so how do you weigh up the merits of people's jobs and employment, the company staying in business, with some sort of, ethical infraction, and how serious that is, and what impact that's going to have on people and so forth. And so I think, Reid, to your point, it's having those structures where you're able to have those debates and ultimately reach a conclusion for which there's no right or wrong, but one that you can explain and that you're prepared to go forward with.
I wouldn't say that there's no right or wrong. I would say that there's a set of permissible options that can be mutually incompatible. But there's also a set of impermissible actions which you should not choose from. So there are wrong things to do. Forget it. Let's just do that with anyone. Who cares? Let's just go for it. Doesn't matter. Not our problem. There's so many actors involved, so many variables, so many moving parts. No one could possibly hold us accountable, and we'll make a ton of money if we do this, right? That is unacceptable. But there are non-ideal but permissible options that could be mutually incompatible. But you're right that what's important in that case is you do your due diligence by thinking through the reasons for choosing one over the other. And one in that set, as opposed to one in the set of unacceptable choices.
I think it's very difficult for organizations that have the same person that needs to make a lot of decisions, not only business, but others that are very closely related. Vendor selection is a great one, partner selection, business development, strategy, all are having ethical decision at one point or another that needs to be made. And I think that's why in certain situations, I've seen it work better if there's a neutral person that doesn't have to worry about making those, that can just advise. But like you said, they need to have some teeth to also influence it.
I also want to add, I think, Jane, you're absolutely right. If you can put it in the contract, that's great. One of the things that I think is also important is not to bury all the requirements and legalese, though. Right. So let's say you have a bunch of data and you're partnering with a company that is going to handle that data, use that data, train AI with that data, and so on and so forth. You need to do your due diligence to make sure that it's not just the lawyers who understand what can and cannot be done with the data, but that the product developers done with the data that you're giving them access to. And I think that means at least sometimes direct conversations with those people. So even though they weren't involved with, say, those product developers on the partner side during the business negotiations, nonetheless, you need to play some kind of role in onboarding them to make sure that they understand in their language, not the language of the lawyers, in their language what they can and cannot do.
No, that's a very good point.